Hello, my name is Hooshyar Afsarzadeh, and today I will be talking about critical race theory, truth, and myth. A quick introduction of who I am. I'm one of the founders of Racism Awareness Project, rapusa.org, rapusa.org. And what we do is that we actually work with many communities around the United States to have interactive programs and bring awareness on issues of racial justice and having a view of US history that is from the perspective of racial justice. I'm also a member of the editorial board of Peak magazine that is issued by the Persian Culture Center in San Diego. And I have written numerous articles for Peak and other publications on issues of race, racial justice, and how it is related to the Iranian American community. As you know, every odd year election after a presidential election is actually an indication of what is to come in the midterm elections. So, for example, the presidential elections of 2020 were followed by the governor races in Virginia and New Jersey in 2021. That were a good indication of what is to come. One issue that were heavily used in these elections by the Republican Party and by certain media channels like Fox News was the issue of critical race theory, also known as CRT, and how discussion of race and racism impacts the educational system in the United States. 9 states, namely Idaho, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Arizona, and North Dakota, have passed legislation, and only Arizona's legislation was overturned by the state Supreme Court that actually have curbed or limited how race and racism and other issues like the LGBTQ issues related to gender and sexuality could be discussed in the educational system or could be taught. The legislation has mostly banned discussion, training, and orientation around how race has played a role in the US history. The claim of the Republican Party and Republican candidates and certain media outlets like Fox News is that CRT itself views the United States as an inherently racist country. And then the bans and limiting legislations have now also gone to the area of what books could be in the libraries or school libraries or could be studied as part of the school lessons. And PEN America, a group that stands for free expression and human rights in the United States, reported in April that there are at least 1,500 book bans in public schools in the United States, with Texas, Pennsylvania, and Florida leading the pack in that order. These bans are not limited to race topics, even though the race plays a major role in these bans. They also include LGBTQ related material, and other areas. Florida bans also include even math books because racial bias statistics were used in discussing graphs in certain parts of the book. So that gives you an introduction of how CRT is heavily used for political gain in the United States at this point in our history. Just to give you a better sense, it was actually reported by Brookings Institute that in less than 4 months before November of 2021, where the odd year elections after presidential elections of 2020 were held, in those 4 months, Fox News mentioned CRT, used the word CRT and critical race theory 1,300 times in its broadcast. So that gives you kind of a good sense of how CRT has been used. So let's discuss about CRT and look at what it is. What is CRT? What is critical race theory? The most basic aspect of critical race theory is that race is a social construct and was pretty much made up for social, political, and economic gain. What does it mean that it's a social construct? It means that there is no scientific basis to race, and the main purpose of its creation was to gain and have advantages from social, economic, and political views. So when did this whole topic started in human history? It is actually not that old. It was created in Western Europe about 400 years ago in an era or time in the human history also called Enlightenment. And during this era of Enlightenment, many of the Enlightenment thinkers came up with the idea of human hierarchy, that human race was divided into different groups, and the white race was a top symbol of intelligence, beauty, and work ethics, and most of them had Africans and Black race as at the bottom of this hierarchy, as symbols of ugliness and lack of intelligence and laziness. So this has been used in the past 400 years to create significant gaps from an economic, social, and political views or perspectives in societies all over the world, mainly in Europe and the Americas. Now, when we say there is no scientific basis to race, what is really behind that? In year 2000, a major project that was sponsored by the US government ended, called the Human Genome Project. The purpose of that project was, for the first time in human history, to identify all the genes that basically make up human beings. Genes are the most basic biological elements of being human, or any living creature, or in the world. The Human Genome Project concluded, after identifying all the human genes and mapping human DNA, that all human beings in the world share 99.97% of their DNA. And all other differences are superficial differences that are results of living for hundreds or thousands of years in different climate. And because there are different levels of sun exposure and sunshine, and different levels of temperature and rain, and so on and so forth, human beings living in different areas of the world develop different features. But these features are superficial. They're only at the surface just to deal with the climate. And they're not really basic aspects of being human, going back to our genes. Since the year 2000, certain groups have worked very hard to identify a race gene, and they have been unsuccessful. So that is the most basic aspect of CRT, or critical race theory, meaning that there is no scientific basis to the topic of race. It was created for social, political, and economic gain. Now, what it has resulted is that there is significant, huge differences and gaps between races. For example, in the United States, the median wealth right in the middle of the whole population sector of a Black family is 1/10 of the median wealth of a white family. The Hispanic median wealth is not much better. It's about somewhere between 1/8 and 1/9. And so there are major disparities. And it's not limited to just economics. From a health perspective, hundreds of years of these gaps and disparities have resulted in major health disparities. And we saw that even more during the pandemic in the last 2.5 years. There are also environmental disparities in terms of where these communities live. Communities of color in the United States live in areas that have a lot more exposure to toxic material or other negative environmental elements compared to white sections of the society, or the ones that are considered as white. Even the US government has acknowledged that the way it puts racial categories together in the census that is done every 10 years in the United States is not scientific, but it's really for the purpose of federal government programs to confront and fight discrimination. So even the US government agrees with this idea that race does not have any scientific basis. Now, why did we actually talk about this in detail? Because one sneaky way to get basically to keep these disparities and differences in place is to use the term color blindness. Basically, the idea is, okay, so if you say race doesn't have any scientific basis, I'm colorblind. Why don't we just forget about race and be colorblind? Seemingly, it sounds very good. Yet it's a sneaky way to keep the gaps in place. Yes, race does not have any scientific basis, and it was made up for social, economic, and political gain. But after 400 years, it has become a reality, a social reality that impacts and affects tens of millions of people only in the United States. In the United States alone, hundreds of millions of people around the world, if not more. So by just saying color blindness and forgetting about race, you're actually helping these disparities to be kept in place. Now, that is used by the Republican Party today and certain media channels like Fox News to call CRT and critical race theory racist. So, which is not true, meaning that actually CRT promotes an idea of racial justice and racial equality and stands for that. And it's not actually promoting the idea of racism. One other major aspect of CRT is the idea of intersectionality. And what it means is that in order to really understand one's identity, a person's identity in society, we need to look at different aspects that are overlapping and come together in an intersectional way to identify one in the society. And these aspects that are intersectioned are race, gender, class, economic place, sexuality, ethnicity, and even citizenship or immigration status. That's the idea of intersectionality. If you really think about it, it is very commonsensical. And that's what CRT promotes. Two main thinkers and founders, there are many, who are identified with CRT are Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. Both of them, in case of Bell, he was a university professor, and Crenshaw is today a university professor. Bell came from the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, and he was a civil rights lawyer, worked for the US Justice Department, and then later on for NWC Legal Fund to promote racial justice in the criminal justice system. He played a major role in desegregation or integration of schools during the civil rights movement. He played a major part in integration of 300 schools. And when he finally saw the results in the 70s and 80s, he saw how segregation found a way back in a sneaky way, and the school integration really didn't work. So he became disappointed about those ideas and the results of the civil rights movement, and started to advocate the idea of being critical. What is the word critical? It comes from this school of thought that we need to stand for these ideas that help people liberate or free themselves from power structures that limits or enslaves them. So Bell is considered as one of the founders of critical race theory. He wrote many books. His books are used as textbooks in universities, and he died in 2011. Kimberly Crenshaw is currently a professor of law. Both of them came from a background in law, and she is considered one of the founders of the idea of intersectionality that we just talked about. Her focus really has been to show how a disregard for intersectionality in the criminal justice system has helped to keep racial and social disparities and gender disparities in place. It is also important to mention that intersectionality, and CRT, even though they were created as theories in the 1980s and 90s and up to this point, and they have been kind of adopted by many of the movements, Many of the founders of racial justice movements against slavery in the 19th century, like Sojourner Truth, the picture on your left, and Ida B. Wells, the picture on your right, have actually been the proponents who Ida B. Wells actually lived also in the 20th century. Both of them came from slavery. They were slaves originally, and they worked hard to liberate themselves and stood for not only racial justice, but gender equality and economic equality without necessarily calling it intersectionality or critical race theory. So they actually were activists in action, standing for those intersectional aspects of one's identity long before it became a theory. And their actions made a huge difference. Ending remarks. We have tried to share with you the importance of talking about critical race theory. We have also shown the truth about critical race theory and what it is, and the myths in terms of whether it is racist or not, and how certain concepts like colorblindness are used in a sneaky way to keep racial disparities in place. You can reach me by emailing me at hoosh.afsar, that's HOOSH.AFSAR @rapusa.org with all your comments and inquiries. Thank you very much for watching this program.